We are ready now, George.
Thank
we
you.
Can start with your presentation.
Zorit, so thank you so much. I want to say how happy I am to be contributing to this conference of CEIR, which does such great work in bringing people from different disciplines together and create, CEIR creates a space for fresh thinking. And I hope that colleagues in Belgrade, colleagues in Serbia will, and colleagues who've come from other countries will find the opportunity for fresh thinking on this subject, love and fear in interdisciplinary perspective. And what I want to say will be about ethics, religion, and human limits in war. My topic is really about love and fear in war, but I also want to be addressing the value of interdisciplinary work. So that is a great inspiration for me, and I'm taking the opportunity for some fresh thinking in this area. And in my paper, I engage firstly with the great German Jewish thinker, Franz Rosenzweig, a critic of Hegel and Kant, who wrote his great work, The Star of Redemption, about war, about love and fear in war, and about thinking about life while he was just outside Skopje in Macedonia in 1915, 1916, during the First World War. Like many thinkers, the First World War changed his approach to European thought, changed his attitude to European thought. And I've benefited very much from reading The Star of Redemption to think about love and fear in war and in creating limits in war, in creating the limits to a war that respects humanity. Much writing, and this is the first section of my paper, much writing about war by philosophers and theologians is about the impact of love and fear on human beings. One thinks about the Bible. In Deuteronomy, chapter 20, the chapter is about war, and it's about fear in battle and coping with fear in battle. The greatest fear that soldiers may face is about their loved ones at home. So love and fear are not necessarily totally separate or opposed. Augustine writes about war and soldiers and the duty of a Christian in relation to his great theme, passion. And Clausewitz, in a much more secular context, writes about war, and the central theme in his work is about passion and the fog of war. And the fog of war is created by passion and by fear. Friction means in war you cannot think only in terms of reasonable categories. You can't only use a rational approach to war. Clausewitz frames his thinking about war in terms of passion and fear. Aquinas writes about war in his Summa Theologica in the context of his discourse about love. And so just war theory, based on the short passages about war in Augustine and Aquinas, is also framed in terms of love. Much of that writing does mix the reality that love and fear both impact on thinking in war and thinking about war. And in a secular context, and well beyond the philosophical sphere, writers about war have continued to think about the problems of being rational and limiting war through reason, or using reason to provide institutional limits to war, legal limits to war. those writers have also thought the problems we face are about real people, real soldiers, real generals, real soldiers and real politicians who think about war because they think about their loved ones and they think about themselves in fearful situations. Michael Walzer has tried to rationalize about what is justifiable conduct in war. And he points out that you can't think about this without thinking about the natural feelings of a human being in a war situation. And a human being in a war situation will see another human being and they will not want, insofar as they really see that human being, they will not want to shoot them. The murder of a person is unnatural. And in order to persuade someone that they must do the right thing and protect people, or do the right thing and remove the threat posed by someone, you have to persuade them to overcome their natural feelings, the natural distaste at murder. You have to persuade someone that it's not murder, that killing is not murder. So in thinking about the reasons for engaging in war, one is thinking about fear and one is thinking about love. In thinking about transgressions of civilized norms, also we're thinking about love and fear. So we have films like The Band of Brothers, American films about war, very often about soldiers fighting together and fighting not because of any abstract theory or an attachment to democracy or a hatred of dictatorship, but because the band of brothers, being there, you protect your fellow soldier. You care more about the fellow soldier than you care about the army as a whole, or the government that you're fighting for, or the abstract people that you're fighting for. And in developing military ethics education in America and in Europe, very often the love for the band of brothers is a key feature of thinking about how war should be fought and also how war shouldn't be fought. The educators who are given the task of limiting war and explaining the limits of war try to focus on reason. More than they focus on love and fear, they try to focus a cadet or an officer or a general on reasoning, on objective terms. They try to instill the idea that there's such a thing as a professional soldier or a professional officer, a professional naval officer, or a professional in the Air Force who uses reason. But war cannot be thought of only in terms of the professional and reason without also thinking about controlling passion and controlling fear. And the Red Cross has found this as well. In my paper, I go on to talk about the latest 2 reports of the Red Cross about how to make armies follow the legal limits in the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. And in the 1980s, 1970s, the Red Cross realized that the law of war was not being followed. They did interdisciplinary studies to examine why the law was not being followed and how to make the law followed by the military. They used sociologists and psychologists and lawyers, and they decided that group psychology was the breakdown factor. Groups don't follow law unless you make them follow law. They relied on hierarchy and punishment because that's the way armed actors work. That's the way militaries work. And they relied on training, integrating lessons about the law into training of the military. And some 25 30, 40 years later, they began to see this wasn't working at all. They did another study, another interdisciplinary study, this time with psychologists and specialists in the cultures that, of peoples who are involved in war. They decided that a more positive approach was needed that rested on social identity and on the ethos of an armed actor and on the connections between armed actors and the civilian population that they fought within or alongside. They decided you had to test training that the training should be designed to inculcate positive ethical commitments, not only a negative respect for the law. The positive ethical commitments should be tested under battlefield conditions. So the Red Cross has a really interesting interdisciplinary experiment. I, in my paper, talk about how the limits of that experiment should encourage us to new and further interdisciplinary work. And to my mind, we should work on a broader and a richer understanding of how fear and love affect us culturally and affect us. We need an anthropologist who looks at the contexts in which war happens, and the contexts shape how we think about fear, and our contexts are cultural and local. And I use Franz Rosenzweig to rethink this in my paper, but I'm really not trying to present in my paper an argument that my colleagues, my dear colleagues in Serbia and in Bosnia and in Croatia, that you should follow my perspective on this. I think we need a period of interdisciplinary experimentation, and conversations such as this one give me hope that internationally we will have that conversation. And CEIR, I know, takes culture and religion and ethics very seriously in its programming. And that's one reason that I'm just really glad to have had this short opportunity to share my paper with you in this oral way. I love feedback. I welcome feedback. Thank you, Zorica.
Thank you, George. Now we can talk a little about your attitude toward war and peace and ethic. And as I understand, it is very difficult to control anything in war, and law and people feelings, and you don't know what's happened. If you are a soldier or if you are in a common way in your work, it is difficult, and I am against the war in any way. But what you are thinking about that?
Thank you. So in my work, I seek to engage with people of all perspectives who are in a military or who are against all violence. In a military, there is very often a distinction drawn between violence and justified force or self-defense. But I seek to engage with all perspectives, and I really find Franz Rosenzweig's work on this very appealing. He came from, I don't believe that he has a position on whether war is justified or not justified, except the factors that he sees making war unjustifiable in the First World War are the following. He sees that it's very difficult to measure the distance between you and your enemy and the distance between you and your friend. In Rosenzweig's thought, we fear and we love in a blind way. And in our blindness, we seek to overcome huge distances. And war and the use of force is one way of overcoming distance and enforcing a solution. Rosenzweig sees that as fanatical. So he's not against self-defense. He explicitly says there can be such a thing as self-defense, but in modern warfare, just as in ancient warfare, there are those who attempt to overcome distance through objectifying, through an objectifying lens. But the distances between people are subjective, and it's fanatical to try and overcome distance that should be really about the subject of conversation. Politics should be about conversation and neighborliness. It should be about close relationships, and the attempt to use force or to control anyone through objectifying patterns of thought, objectifying philosophy, that's the root of violence in his view. And instead he's asking us to focus on subjective relationships or intersubjective relationships, and to focus on being close to each other. And I find that lens very appealing. Of course, so he says there should not be any civil war. Of course, you can say there should not be any civil war, and there should not be any imperialist violence. The realism should say to us that these things will happen. And I think Rosenzweig is not at all saying that those things are correct or right or justified, but nor is he saying that they won't happen. I think he is quite realistic about what happens and that it will happen. I think he's right to turn the lens on objectifying approaches, but nor can you get rid of objectifying approaches. I think that's the challenge for the interdisciplinary conversation, is to bring objectifying scientific disciplines into relationship with arts and humanities and subjective approaches.
Okay, thank you, George. You are talking about secular context and about where is religion involved in this war. What is differences between this kind of, is it possible to have wartime without religion and include in that?
That depends what you mean by religion, or what I mean by religion. Because I think war and religion have developed in parallel from the time of the beginning of history, from the time of the agricultural revolution, the ancient agricultural revolution, which led to the centralization of civilizations, to the development of money, to the development of hierarchical religion, to the use of religion in promoting the interests of hierarchies. And so there's a connection between war and religion. And from that time, you can see wars being waged with a discourse about sacrifice. And we make soldiers sacrifice on our behalf, and we value their sacrifice. And we have done for some thousands of years. One can ask, is this sacrifice, which uses the language of religion and value, is this sacrifice actually about religion? Is it about the individual human's religion, or is it about the glue that is used to make us conform? Will religion and will a discourse of sacrifice always be involved in combat and in peace building, in reconciliation work? I can see many answers, and again, that depends on what you think religion is. And the the religious studies discipline has not answered that question fully or finally. And so that partly rests on the fact that many religious studies specialists see sacrifice as the ultimate religious act, whereas other religious studies approaches suggest that religion is a very complicated thing, which we don't fully understand, which has many different elements, and none of these are definitive of what religion is. And so it could be that a discourse about religion in war, a discourse using religion in war, might not actually be about religion at all. And we might reject the idea that a clergy person or a clergyman, clergywoman blessing a ship, a military ship, or blessing a bunch of soldiers, we might reject that that's a religious act at all. That's why I'm saying that there's been no final answer and no full answer. It's a topic that I'm very engaged with and love to see different answers on.
Yes, thank you. I have one more question. It is about 10 commands of God, and one of them, 6, say don't kill. And how it is with war? Is it contradictory to have killing other people when you have one idea? I don't know what can be used. I understand you're talking about when state have some idea of territory, or never mind, and it's secular thoughts, but what's in religion, maybe in the Old Testament, in the Bible, what we are seeing about what's happened with people around. It was different religions, one monotheistic and other polytheistic, and maybe until nowadays we have the same conflict between people who believe in one God and one truth, and other who are in the different side of universal value as life, as you know what I want to know.
Thank you. Yes, so I see two different answers to this. So three different answers. One is to accept that killing is immoral, and a human being with a coherent set of values should reject all killing, including in war. Now, so if there is somebody who accepts that, I'm interested in that and I respect that. Now, also there are these two other approaches, which I cannot dismiss totally. So one is the just war tradition, or discussed as the just war tradition. And that is that it is wrong to kill, it's wrong to murder, and it's also wrong to kill, even if something is not an intentional murder, but there are sometimes conflicts between values and conflicts between threats. And so in the just war tradition, which has grown from a largely Christian and Western European, Latin literature, in this literature, the justification for using force is very often presented as a lesser evil, or as the better approach given contradictory threats. And in the Catholic tradition in particular, the defense for a soldier killing is very often said to be have the right intention to make peace and don't try to kill, but have the intention of stopping a threat. And there in this tradition, the doctrine of double effect means as long as you're not intending to kill, but you are intending to make peace and you are intending to stop a threat, then that is not murder, even if it is not desirable. You could say that there's some legalistic circus trick going on there, or some acrobatic work going on there. It's scholastic trickery, you could say. Does that come from the heart, you might ask? And I've seen theologians and philosophers who try to explain how it does come from the heart, and it's realistic. It's a moral realism, they say. Now, a third approach would be to say the 10 Commandments are central moral statements about what God wants, about what any civilized people should want. That's like a natural law. That's like a basic set of understandings of what you should and shouldn't do in a civilized society. And each of the 10 commandments or the 10 statements are actually much more complicated than they seem. And it's not possible to organize a civilized society only with simple statements. And that's embedded in these simple statements themselves. And the prohibition on killing, or the prohibition on murder, as religious Jews see this, is actually not simple at all. It's not simple because in society we live in complex situations. We face threats that are complex, and in many ways we can commit murder without trying to. So if one tried to simplify this as a law against deliberately murdering, that's not an authentic response to this statement about values. Actually, we can commit murder by omission, acts of omission, by what we failed to do. And that's true of all of the different commandments. We can commit idolatry by placing money above or any object above the situation, the value that it ought to have, and placing people underneath it, individual people underneath it. And so it can be in this more anarchistic version of what law is about, perhaps, it can be that one would accept the need to kill or to accept killing as a lesser evil or as a necessity that remains an evil, part of the web of harms that we are involved in by being in society. And if we step out of society, then we maybe allow the harms to grow even greater. So I am interested in any alternatives to those three perspectives as well.
Thank you, George. I remember your contribution in the last conference when you are talking about guilt of soldier. So we have many emotions in this context of war and peace. And I think every emotion is more than in a normal situation. In a war, people more love and more fear and more guilt also, and shame also. I just like to ask you about the next conference.
Yeah.
We have idea to have next year in the May also to talk about individuality individualism and collectivism. If it is good in English pronunciation, I don't know. What do you think about this to be topic next year?
I like that it's a topic which you could approach descriptively as well as through a normative lens or a prescriptive lens. I like that there's a possibility for thinking differently across cultures, and people very often thinking about wars and politics and human rights and protection, health protection and pandemics, very often thinking about how about that in relation to the way we understand what an individual and the collectivity is culturally. So I like those,
Okay, I think also from a religion discourse, when we are talking about salvation, it's also some religion is in a way of individuality, and other we are all as a collective in God's way acceptable.
Yeah, that's and I see in Christian denominations there are very different approaches to that, and the meaning of salvation is a topic that if we were to look at the way it's understood by the biblical prophets, for instance, we might see different discourses than developed much later. That now salvation seems like a doctrine that is well understood, but in the biblical stories, it might be quite. It might be that there are multiple ways of understanding, or multiple ways of talking about salvation without necessarily claiming to understand it.
Yes, I write about Avram and Isaac, and about this story when Kierkegaard talk about this feeling when they are going to Moria, how it is difficult to understand salvation, and also salvation from Christians' perspective when one must die to give salvation other people, when God is in dying. And it will be good for us to talk about that from interdisciplinary. We include also Buddhist people, and we have a paper about how it is seen from Buddhist perspective.
Very interesting.
Thank you, George, very much.
Dorota, thank you very much. Have a good evening. Have a great conference.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Goodbye.
To everyone.
And say hello to your Hannah and children.
Thank you so much. I will do. Bye.